Welcome to Chapter 15 of our Civil War unit, Johnny Reb and Billy Yank. Johnny Reb. Johnny Reb was the nickname for the Confederate soldiers. They usually wore gray uniforms with either kepi hats or wide brim hats. They carried an Enfield rifle that could have a bayonet fixed to the end. Most volunteers were young men and boys, usually in their late teens or early 20s. They usually came from farm families and knew how to use a gun. They were best known for the Rebel Yell, a battle cry used to frighten and confuse their enemies. They marched to the Confederate anthem, I Wish I Was in Dixie. Billy Yank. Billy Yank was the nickname given to the Union Army soldiers. They usually wore a blue uniform with a kepi hat. They carried a Springfield rifle that could have a bayonet fixed to the end. Like the South, many of the early volunteers were young and usually were no older than their mid-20s. While some of the volunteers came from farming families and knew how to use guns, many came from the city and they had never experienced that. They marched to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Recruitment. At the beginning of the war, both Northern and Southern boys came out to volunteer in large numbers. They were excited for the opportunity of adventure, and some boys who were below the volunteer age even tried to join. They also joined because they believed in the cause that their side was fighting for: the South for independence and the North for unity. Volunteering dropped steadily once word of the rough conditions came back from the battlefield. Initially, the Union tried bribing men to sign up with cash bonuses, gaining many immigrant volunteers. Eventually, both sides had to turn to the draft in order to force able-bodied men to join the Army, making it the first time the U.S. government had to turn to a draft during wartime. This led to some rioting, especially in larger northern cities. The life of a soldier. The life of a soldier was always busy. While battles are the main focus of a war, most battles only last a few days. This left soldiers to spend their free days fixing camp, repairing equipment, and many of the other boring jobs. Between battles, they also had to march long distances, often in inclement weather. This was made worse by their heavy wool uniforms, especially during the summer months. Along with the heavy uniform, they also had to carry 50 pounds of supplies on their backs while they marched. Because of the poor conditions, many men died before reaching battle. Food was also bland, consisting only of bacon, a hardtack biscuit, often rotted or filled with maggots, and flour or cornmeal. Civil War medicine. Army hospitals were an important aspect of a soldier's life, and they were often just as dangerous as the battlefields themselves. Most of the tools were primitive, with doctors relying on amputation in order to save a patient. Many soldiers returned home missing an arm or leg. Even if a soldier survived his wounds, there was still risk of death from other sources, especially infection or disease. During this time, doctors did not know about germs, so they did not wash their hands when they moved to another patient. This led to the unintentional spread of many diseases in the Army hospitals and the unnecessary deaths of many soldiers. African American soldiers. From the beginning of the war, many African Americans tried to volunteer but were turned away because the Army did not want any African American soldiers. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the government changed its mind and many African Americans joined the Union Army. These soldiers included both free Northern African Americans and former slaves. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass encouraged more African Americans to join the Army. He wanted them to fight in order to free the 3.5 million slaves still in the South. He also believed that once they fought for their country, they would no longer be denied the full rights of citizenship. Robert Gould Shaw. He lived from 1837 until 1863. Shaw was born in Boston to abolitionist parents. He attended Harvard University but withdrew before graduating. In 1861, Shaw volunteered for the 7th New York Militia and helped to defend Washington, D.C. Later that year, he joined the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry as a second lieutenant. He fought in the First Battle of Winchester, the battles of Cedar Mountain, and Antietam. In 1862, he was approached by his father to lead a new all-African American regiment for Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts was one of the most famous all-black regiments during the Civil War. In 1863, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the 54th attacked the Confederate Fort Wagner. Despite heavy cannon fire, 100 soldiers made it into the fort and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Their bravery helped others to accept black soldiers in the Union Army. African American soldiers also fought alongside General Grant at the Battle of Vicksburg and in various other battles along the Mississippi. 1/10 of men enlisted in the Army were African American, and a quarter of men enlisted in the Navy were African American. 21 of these soldiers won the military's highest award, the Medal of Honor. Pictured is an image of the memorial to Robert Goldshaw and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. It is currently on display in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Summary. Soldiers on both sides were often young men hoping to support their respective regions. Life between battles was difficult and tedious, with harsh and unhealthy conditions. Please make sure you have all the terms written down and the summary.